of all the trial decks from Macau, I think VOLIBEAR is the one that people were most excited to play, and unfortunately I left it for last. I have a lot of strong opinions about the VOLIBEAR deck, and I'm excited to share them with you. So let's jump into VOLIBEAR, the Relentless Storm. Firstly, if you're not aware, on the Project K community Discord, we play tabletop simulator games for Project K. I'm regularly updating the Project K mod. I think we're finally getting to a point now where we're getting like quote-unquote feature complete for the table. There's one or two more things I want to add, but for the most part, the Project K table is good to go. And if you want to find matches, you can find it on the Project K community Discord. You might have noticed my upload cadence slowed down recently. That's just because, well, A, the holidays are going on right now, but also I've been working on something in the background in cooperation with someone else that I think is going to be really awesome for the Project K community. I'll be announcing that sometime after the holidays. Speaking of which, I'm going to be out of the house for a few days here, so uploads will continue to be slow going forward. But as soon as I'm back, we'll be back to the regular daily uploads that I was at previously. With that said, now we can jump into the Relentless Storm VOLIBEAR. Relentless Storm VOLIBEAR is our orange-red legend of the set, or I should say our Fury physical legend of the set, and he's all about ramp. When you play a unit with +5 might, you may exhaust me to play the top rune exhausted. And this is not the only access to ramp VOLIBEAR has. He runs 2 copies of Mobilize, which is a 2 energy play the top rune of your deck exhausted. And then if you can't draw a card, Catalyst of Aeons, which is a kind of like a 4-cost equivalent of that, which lets you play 2 runes exhausted from the top of your deck. And he even has a Battlefield, which helps with ramp, Obelisk of Power, which just reads at the start of the game, or basically at the start of the game. Basically, on the first turn for everybody, they get an additional rune, which can make a huge difference for VOLIBEAR, because it can let you play cards a turn sooner, which lets you ramp a turn sooner. And yeah, basically ramp is going to be significantly more impactful for you, the VOLIBEAR player, than it is for everyone else. You don't particularly care that this is a symmetrical effect. I also want to mention Sigil of the Storm while we're here, even though this isn't explicitly ramp. I think it works really well for the ramp strategy. When you conquer here, recycle one of your runes. The reason I think this works so well for the ramp strategy is because it impacts you significantly less recycling one of your runes than it does, say, an enemy. And an enemy during the early stages of the game, at the very least, is going to be discouraged to play their cards here, meaning that you'll only really have 1 battlefield in a 1v1 scenario to worry about, and in a free-for-all scenario where there are 3 battlefields, there'll still be less for you to worry about on the board as players are discouraged from playing here. I will also mention another ramp option the deck has available to it, and that's Stormclaw Ursine. Personally, I think when we start optimizing VOLIBEAR lists, we don't actually run Stormclaw Ursine. I think we're better off running the 3 copies of Mobilize and Catalyst of Aeons, and not having to worry about this Stormclaw Ursine, and instead just playing units we would want to play otherwise. Basically, 6 might is a really annoying threshold for something at 7 energy, and I don't think that the tank keyword is enough to justify this slot, basically. Alright, let's talk about the core of the deck. Obviously, we want to be ramping, right? VOLIBEAR's doing that. The ramp cards we've gone over have been doing that, including Stormclaw Ursine, even though, like I said, I don't think it makes the cut. The core engine of the deck is going to be Misfortune and Magma Worm. Now, in the trial deck, you're only running 2 copies of Misfortune and 1 copy of Magma Worm, but these cards really stand out in the deck. First of all, let's focus on Misfortune. She has Accelerate and Ganking, both really good keywords, but she also has the first time I move each turn, you may ready another card. Being able to ready our units is so important for VOLIBEAR because his units are so strong. Letting them attack the turn they come into play, or I should say move the turn that they come into play, is a massive deal. So Misfortune allows you to do that. Keeping Misfortune alive is extremely important, so being careful about where you move her when you go to ready your other card is something you need to be mindful of. Magma Worm is kind of like Misfortune in the sense that it's readying a card that you put into play, but it's significantly more safe. Misfortune kind of has to put herself in danger, so generally speaking, you'll move something, you'll re-ready something, and then that'll kind of be the entirety of Misfortune's impact, because by the time it gets back to your turn rotation, Misfortune probably died. You don't have a lot of ways of protecting her. Maybe sometimes she lives and it's really good for you, but for the most part, she has to put herself in danger to be able to utilize her ability. Magma Worm can just sit on the base. There's going to be a time and a place to push Magma Worm, but at the end of the day, these cards are doing very similar things and just readying our big units. Speaking of our big units, what are our payoffs? Well, the deck runs Tryndamere, which is a good payoff because it lets you potentially cheat the 8th point of the game, which is a really strong effect, obviously. I will say, though, you cannot combo Tryndamere and Misfortune or Tryndamere and Magma Worm on the same turn. Misfortune or Magma Worm would have to live a turn rotation, because in order for Misfortune to be able to move and then obviously resolve her ability to ready Tryndamere, you're going to have to use her Accelerate cost. And if you use her Accelerate cost, she's essentially a 6 energy card. 6 plus 7 equals 13. We can't get to 13 energy. So that combination of cards needs to be played out over the course of a couple turns, but it does feel really insane when it goes off. Furious Volibear is also similarly quite strong. In fact, I would argue this is probably like the prime card in the deck that you want to be readying, because it's such a huge impact on boards that are going wide. Like a lot of Victor boards are really upset to see this Volibear card, although I will say they have a lot of good answers to it with things like Cull. So, you know, be careful on that end. Its Deflect 2 can be really meaningful as well. Like, Yasuo players are typically going to be annoyed to have to remove this, even though they usually have an answer like a Rebuke or even Possession, which you have to be really careful of. But typically speaking, if they're dealing with this Volibear, they're giving up a lot of runes. So as long as you're not losing the next turn when they deal with this, it's probably not that big of a deal, especially if you manage to live a turn rotation with the Magma Worm still up. People think of Volibear as the primary threat, but really Magma Worm is making him such a big threat, because playing a Volibear raw without being able to re-ready it with a Misfortune, or being able to have it enter ready with something like Magma Worm, the card is typically speaking just a little bit too slow. I'll take this time to mention Stormbringer, which is Volibear's signature spell. This is a very, very, very powerful effect. My initial interpretation of this card was that it wasn't very is basically that it was overhyped, but I was completely wrong. Stormbringer is a crazy combo. Basically, it's a board clear and then your unit gets to move, which the timing on that is very nice. Being able to clear the board, then push your card there, get your point, and then basically set it up as like a defense for the following turn. As for other removal pieces, we have Challenge, which is a really strong effect to be able to remove something on the board that you otherwise wouldn't be able to interact with, especially because none of the targets involved with the challenge have to be at a battlefield. And a lot of your units are going to have high might values that go over the top of other units. So if the opponent player is like a Yasuo or something, you can challenge targeting your Tryndamere or Volibear and then just removing the Yasuo without ever having to engage with it, which is really nice. It's just a really solid removal option, and I'd be shocked if this isn't 3 of in like every deck that's orange. It's just really, really solid. Even if there are cases where you're going to play this and it's not going to kill the target, it's still going to feel relatively decent, because at the end of the day, it's just such flexible targeting. Like a lot of removal effects in the game have at battlefield or something along those lines, and challenge being able to target anything is just such a big deal. I guess I'll quickly mention Disintegrate, even though I think it's probably one of the weaker cards in the deck. This is an example of a card that needs to target battlefield, and as a result, it feels relatively restricted. You have to play this kind of on curve to really get value out of it. If you play this in the later stages of the game, it usually feels like there's probably better things you could have been doing with your energy. But like I said, if you play it on curve, like exactly when you get access to 4 energy, it doesn't feel too bad. I will say that this might feel better in a constructed list for Volibear. Part of the reason this feels so weak is because a lot of the plays that you want to be doing take up too much energy to be able to really weave in a Disintegrate. But if you have a slightly lower curve in an optimized Volibear list, then Disintegrate might feel a little bit stronger. But in this specific context of the trial deck, I would say that Disintegrate definitely feels like one of the weaker cards of the deck. Carnivorous Snapvine, on the other hand, definitely feels like one of the stronger cards of the deck. This card absolutely makes huge tempo swings. Being able to develop a 6 might card is already pretty decent at 5. Obviously, we're spending the 2 runes. We wouldn't just pay for this normally, but its effect allowing you to essentially remove anything. Again, this is another thing that has that kind of flexible targeting, able to target opponents' bases and battlefields and whatever. There's no specific restriction on this card, which is awesome. 6 is an important threshold to be at. A lot of key cards are at 6 as opposed to 5, so it at the very least will trade with most targets. Yeah, this is an absolutely crazy card. A Blazing Scorch I go back and forth on and whether I think it's strong or not, but the too long didn't read version is, I think once we have access to the full card pool, Blazing Scorcher doesn't make the cut in like an optimized Volibear list, but for now, it feels really solid. Just because the percentage chance of you filling in your curve without having to recycle a rune is kind of a big deal, because it kind of gives you +1 to your runes. Like, let's say, for example, you don't hit your ramp card on turn 2 for Catalyst of Aeons, but you did hit Obelisk of Power or something for your battlefield. Well, now, going into turn 2, you can play Blazing Scorcher, where you otherwise wouldn't be able to, and that will ramp your card without having to recycle any cards, so going into the next turn, you'll be at 8, which is an important threshold for another one of the cards that we'll talk about here in a moment. But even if you don't efficiently use that 8 the following turn, it's important to get basically as much runes as you can, because of the recycle system in this game. You're going to want to spend a lot of recycling, especially while playing Volibear, because you have access to, we have ways of returning some of those runes. So getting your rune count nice and high as quickly as possible is massive. The deck runs Legion Rearguard, which I absolutely think is incorrect. I don't think we need to be running this Legion Rearguard card. I'll talk a bit more about this concept when I talk about the cards that I would add to a Volibear list, but basically we don't need a 2-cost card in a Volibear list unless it has some other type of utility that the deck is missing. And again, we'll talk about that shortly. A Dead Bloom Predator is a relatively good card. I do think this is pretty overhyped. I don't think this is as strong as some of the other options the deck has, and I think when we get deck building choices, when we have access to a larger card pool and we start optimizing Volibear lists, I think Dead Bloom Predator will probably get cut, just because there are combinations of cards that are better to be doing than developing an 8 energy card. It's kind of nice that it has Deflect, but oftentimes I feel kind of pigeonholed when playing this card. I will say, in the context of specifically the trial decks, like trial decks versus trial decks, I think Dead Bloom Predator feels relatively strong, but so far in the constructed games I've been playing where we're actually modifying the contents of our deck, Dead Bloom Predator has always felt like one of my weaker options. Cadrigan the Infernal is a little bit more of a win more card, I think. The 2 recycle cost is pretty expensive. Don't get me wrong, the 9 might is great, but basically I don't think I'm often in a board state where I'm drawing many cards from this, and if I am drawing many cards from this, I'm probably in a board state where I'm winning the game regardless of what Cadrigan is doing. So Imposing Volibear is interesting to think about because it's the most expensive card in the deck, and it's obviously relatively strong. The real question is it worth spending 12 for this? I wish this had a 3 recycle cost, not for any particular reason. It's just kind of weird that you recycle 2 at 12, so you go down to 10, you use the Volibear effect to go from 10 to 11, and then the next turn you quote-unquote draw 2 from your pile, but obviously you're only going to have 1, so it's just, I don't know, it feels kind of weird that you're only ever going to be playing this in the Volibear list, and this recycle cost basically doesn't matter anyway. You might as well make it the 3 recycle cost, and it feels a bit more perfect when you start your next turn and you draw 2 from your deck and you fill back up to 12. It's just a weird thematic thing. Like if I was in the design room, like might as well just make it 3 recycle costs. Anyway, regardless of that side tangent, once you get this card onto a battlefield, that battlefield all of a sudden feels really safe, outside of, you know, removal spells, but assuming the opponent actually has to fight you and combat you, the shield 3 is massive. Going to 13 might, just whenever you're defending, is kind of a big deal. I wish more cards had the shield keyword. I'm excited to see, you know, the rest of the card pool and see what has shield. Obviously, if it's a keyword, lots of things are gonna, or not lots, but you know what I mean. A good number of cards are going to be representing this keyword. As for Volibear himself, I will say that in a lot of matchups, this feels really, really weak. I think the optimal way of using Imposing Volibear and Furious Volibear, which is the red version of Volibear we talked about earlier, I think the way that you're supposed to use these 2 cards is that you use Imposing Volibear as your champion slot, or your partner champion, and then you use 3 copies of regular Volibear in the deck, because I don't think you're ever really going to want to be playing 2 Imposing Volibears, so we don't run any copies of it in the deck, but it is a relatively powerful card. And in this context, we would kind of use the Legend slot as a sideboard, where we don't ever really intend to be using our partner Legend, we're just using the cards that we draw. But then in the scenarios where we do need the 12 energy Imposing Volibear, we can use it from our partner slot. The main reason I think the partner slot is just significantly less valuable in the Volibear list than it is in, say, Yasuo, Victor, or Jinx, is that Volibear, either Volibear, right, the 12-1 or the 10-1, are both so expensive that by the time that you have the energy to play them, and the energy to play them in an efficient way, where you're not giving up too much tempo, or you're not giving up too much energy, or you still have some energy to work with going into the following turn, or the following turn cycle, I should say, it's more likely than not that you've just drawn a natural Volibear. So like I said, I could see a world where we just run 3 copies of Furious Volibear in the list, and we don't put any of them in the partner slot, but we do run the Imposing Volibear in the partner slot, and 0 copies of it in the main deck. It's either that, or we just cut Imposing Volibear, to be honest, because I do think it is just a bit too slow. Like I said, it feels really good if you can get it onto a battlefield, so like if you conquer a battlefield and then play Imposing Volibear at that battlefield, it feels really good, because whatever you put in that slot, like for example, let's say you play Misfortune, turn prior to you hitting 12, and then on your next turn you push Misfortune to a battlefield, re-readying something and doing whatever, and then playing Volibear on that battlefield with Misfortune, the odds of Misfortune being removed is relatively low. Lastly, I'll just quickly discuss Voidgate. Voidgate is the 3rd battlefield for Volibear, and when I say 3rd, I mean it's the 3rd one we're talking about, but also that it's the 3rd one, as in the first one that you want to cut. This is just such a weird card to have in the Volibear lineup. Really the only cards it synergizes with is like Disintegrate, and Volibear Furious, and I don't think either of those are like a strong enough effect to warrant having Void Gate in the list. I mean, it has synergy with Volibear, and a good amount of synergy with Volibear, but why would your opponent ever play into the Void Gate to set up for your crazy Volibear? Obviously, there's going to be scenarios where they need to, but for the most part, they'll probably just avoid setting up on the Void Gate because of your Furious Volibear. There are a couple battlefields I would suggest including as a replacement. One is Reaver's Row, potentially. Reaver's Row is interesting for Misfortune because it's a lot of free movement for Misfortune. You can push Misfortune onto Reaver's Row, hopefully there's nothing there at the time, and then on the crackback, when the opponent tries to respond to the fact that you put a Misfortune up on the battlefield, they can't really remove it because you can just retreat it with the Reaver's Row effect. Although I will say a lot of decks have ways of taking advantage of Reaver's Row, and I'm not sure if the one Volibear interaction, or sorry, the one Misfortune interaction is worth risking putting this in your battlefield list when other decks might be able to take advantage of it in an easier way. Similar things can be said for Targon's Peak. Targon's Peak lets you set up for a challenge during an opponent's turn, which can also be very highly impactful. But again, part of the problem is that if you include Targon's Peak, Yasuo players and even Victor players are going to have an easier time of taking advantage of Targon's Peak than you will. Windswept Hillock is interesting to think about for the Volibear player, because if you do manage to put a big unit on Windswept Hillock, you can kind of swing it over to another battlefield for a massive tempo swing. There is a concern that obviously Yasuo players could take advantage of this a bit easier than you can, but honestly I do think Windswept Hillock is the third battlefield for Volibear right now before we get access to the full battlefield list. I run Windswept Hillock in mine, and I think it works pretty well. I also don't mind running Zorn Warrens. I just think like Zorn Warrens as an effect is just kind of okay, just for anybody. It doesn't even have to be Jinx. Obviously Jinx likes it the most because there's good strong combos that Jinx can take advantage of it with, but really any deck is absolutely fine. I also want to mention that the Grand Plaza is a battlefield that people should consider more when they're looking at their battlefield list, and it's not because you're trying to use the effect on Grand Plaza, it's that the condition to resolve Grand Plaza is so difficult to achieve that I think in a lot of cases you can just think of the Grand Plaza as a battlefield with no game text, which if you can't think of a battlefield to add to your lineup that makes a lot of sense for you, the Grand Plaza being kind of like a neutral battlefield is often going to be better than giving the opponent something that they're more likely to get synergy from, like a Targon's Peak or like a Reaver's Row. So yeah, just basically, I think more people should be considering Grand Plaza in their battlefield lineup to avoid giving their opponents effects that they want. I do quickly want to go over a few cards that I think are worth running in the Volibear list. In fact, I think they're so worth running in the Volibear list that you should definitely make these adjustments to the trial deck. First is Brazen Buccaneer, which is in the Jinx deck. This card lets you discard a card, reducing its cost down to 4, effectively making it a 4-cost 5-might card, which means you can play this on turn 2, ramping for Volibear, meaning going into turn 3, you'll be at 7 energy, as opposed to the 6 that you would be at by default. Really, there isn't a ton of utility to getting to specifically 7. It lets you play Trendemir on turn 3, which I guess actually does matter some percentage of the time, but really it's just about ramping as much as possible. It's also worth mentioning that because this can reduce its cost down to 4, and because its base cost is 6, it makes for a pretty good combo with Stormbringer. If you only have access to 10 energy, you can discard a card to make this a 2-card combo that deals 5 to a battlefield and moves the Brazen Buccaneer there. And if you're already at 12, you could just play this naturally without having to discard the card and doing the same thing. 5 damage at the battlefield and then pushing the Brazen Buccaneer is typically going to result in you capturing, or conquering, I should say, that battlefield. Another card that combos really well with Stormbringer, and another card that I think is just should be included in the Volibear list, is Warwick. Warwick is an extremely powerful card. Entering ready with no other conditions is already a really good start. It's kind of like just paying the acceleration cost on a Blazing Scorcher, which is a card we went on earlier, but its game text is absolutely nuts. When attacking, he destroys all damaged enemies at that battlefield. You can combo this with Stormbringer for what is a guaranteed board wipe. Obviously, there's things like Counterspell that stops the Stormbringer, but excluding effects like a Counterspell, there's no power threshold, or no might threshold, I should say, that Warwick plus Stormbringer can't get over the top of, because Stormbringer does the 5 damage to everything at the battlefield, and then everything that lives will die to Warwick's attacking effect when you go into the combat, which will happen because Stormbringer forces Warwick to move there. This is kind of a fun combo to use on a location, or I should say on a battlefield like Windswept Hillock, because Warwick enters ready. You can use the Stormbringer effect plus Warwick to push onto Windswept Hillock, clearing everything that's there, and then move Warwick with the ganking effect, because he's still readied when he gets pushed onto the battlefield with Stormbringer, move it to another battlefield and capture 2 points in a single turn with Warwick plus Stormbringer, which can be a pretty big swing, especially in those scenarios where you need to make a comeback because you've given up the early stages of the game as the Volibear player. I'll also mention Flame Chompers, which I know seems weird, but occasionally there just are situations where you just didn't get the early game that you needed, you didn't hit your ramp. Just having a body you can put on board isn't the worst thing in the world, but I really wanted to mention it for the Brazen Buccaneer. For a while there, I was running Brazen Buccaneer, Flame Chompers, and Zorn Warrens with the goal of just occasionally discarding the Flame Chompers and getting to play it for free. Having the extra body on the board can be a huge deal, especially because there's cards like Cull running around, which forces you to destroy one of your own units. If you have that extra body on the board like a Flame Chompers that you generated more or less for quote-unquote free, obviously it's not actually free, but you understand what I'm saying, quote-unquote free, you can kill that off and feel pretty good about it, as opposed to having to kill off like a Brazen Buccaneer or a Volibear or one of these cards that was a significantly higher commitment than, say, something like a Flame Chompers. I'm not saying that this is optimal, it's just something to consider. In fact, of all these cards I mentioned, this is definitely the most sketchy of them, but it's just something you want to maybe consider if you're already running the Brazen Buccaneer, or if you've pivoted into the Zorn Warrens for your third battlefield. And then lastly, the card that I think is absolutely required for Volibear lists, and maybe it's not exactly the most intuitive include, but it's actually Vi. Like I said, I think Vi is auto-include for Volibear. You already want access to a relatively cheap body, like we were kind of talking about for Flame Chompers. Vi is probably the best of those cheap bodies because A, she has ganking, which is just kind of okay. But in addition to her just being one of those early game bodies that we talked about, one of those things that we don't particularly mind if it gets killed by Cull, or at least we much prefer it to be killed by Cull than, say, one of those bigger things that we spend a lot to get into play. She also has a handful of combos that are really important for the deck. First of all, Challenge combos really well with Vi. Because we can dynamically alter her might value, we can alter her might value to exactly what we need out of her and then use Challenge to kill off whatever target we need. The fact that she can be readied by, say, something like a Misfortune, she can be readied by a Misfortune, or she can be readied by a Magma Worm, both within the same turn, right? Because she's so cheap and she has the ability to generate a lot of might on her own effect. Obviously, she's not going to be generating like 18 might like she would in, say, like a Jinx deck, but in a Volibear list, even if we can get her up to 6 or 7 or like somewhere in that range, being able to have her ready either with Misfortune or Magma Worm can make a huge tempo swing. But let's not forget Stormbringer. The Vi Stormbringer combo is absolutely huge. If the opponent sets up for a big board on a battlefield, Vi plus Stormbringer is a huge board wipe in most cases. Let's say, for example, we can only get Vi to 4 might. There's only one card that we can recycle with Vi. I don't think that will be the case very often. I think most of the times, even in a Volibear list, by the time you're trying to do this type of combo, you're usually going to have, I would say, like 4 cards in your trash. But let's say you only have 1, and you can get Vi to 4. You're still clearing most of that board, if not all of it, because Vi is going to deal 4 before she gets pushed onto the battlefield. So she's going to deal 4 to everything, or Stormbringer is at the very least. That'll clear most things on a wide board, and on a tall board, anything that lives will get hit by Vi for 4 damage afterwards. So even in what is probably like our quote-unquote worst case scenario for Vi, she's killing anything with 8 might or less with the Stormbringer combo, which is nuts. I really think with all the cards we talked about, that combo with her, Magma Worm, Misfortune, and Stormbringer, Vi is absolutely auto-include in Volibear lists. Anyway, that's everything I need to say about Volibear. There's a lot to talk about. This is why I left Volibear until last, because there's honestly so many interesting things to think about for the Volibear list. Anyway, I hope to see you on the Project K community Discord, and I hope to see you coming to play games on Tabletop Simulator. Keep being awesome, and I'll catch you in the next one.